Whether you realize it or not, most of us will have crossed paths with an aroid at some point in our lives. This odd family of plants has nearly conquered the globe and is absent only from the coldest regions of our planet. Some have even left their land-loving cousins behind for a fully aquatic habit. Aroids, as it's known to science, is also a family of superlatives. Aroids lay claim to both the smallest flowering plant in the world, as well as the largest unbranched inflorescence. It is nearly impossible to make generalizations about this family, but that does not detract from the sense of awe one gets with even the slightest bit of familiarity with these plants. We are heading to the Missouri Botanical Gardens to explore the largest living collection of aroids in the world and meet a couple of people who have fallen in love with these plants. Dr. Tom Croat has spent the last 50 years building up this collection, and Emily Coletti is the horticulturist in charge of keeping them happy and growing. The combined experience of these two phytophiles is proof of just how special these plants truly are. So join us as we explore this incredible living collection of aroids and learn about the value living collections like this have for science, horticulture, but most importantly, conservation.
There were lots of times when it was really quite dangerous, of course. I mean, when I was in Costa Rica one time, I rolled down the mountain with the road caved way in. We rolled 7 times down a mountain with my wife and 2 kids in the car, in the truck. It was a brand new pickup, and it had wings, mirrors sticking out like this. But surprisingly, when we got to the bottom, even the mirrors weren't broken off. We were just rolling through trees, vegetation. This sort of young vegetation. I guess somebody else had rolled off there earlier, perhaps. So it was just like rolling slowly 7 times until it got to the bottom. And then it landed on its side with the back end in the river, the front end hanging on a big stone. And my wife, we both walked out the window because it was gone. The front window was missing. And she was trying to find my son who was missing. She got into the river, was carried away in the water. And the next thing I noticed, she was 100 meters down the river, crawling out. She had broken her arm, but she didn't even realize it. And then I crawled up on the big stone, and my son was actually clear up on the top, way up at the top. He had fallen out the window on the first revolution. So my daughter, was kind of banged up because she had made it all the way to the bottom in this cement mixer. Nope. They never wanted to go back again.
If there was ever a feature that unites aroids together into a single family, it's the means by which they present their flowers. With very few exceptions, aroids produce what is called an inflorescence. Now, this structure can look radically different from one species to the next, but the basic form is recognizable if you know what to look for.
That's the part that is more amazing to me, is that they have a totally different look, growth habit, and maybe their juvenile stage than they do as an adult. And sometimes they might have tiny little leaves, and then when they're adult, they're just, huge. And they might be a vine as a juvenile, but as they grow into the adult stage, the internodes shrink and the leaves get bigger, and the shape and the sizes, that's more amazing to me than anything else, how the same plant just appears so differently at different times and different stages. Well, some of them are very, very predictable, and it's fun just to see the predictability of them. And like with them, there's over 200 species of Amorphophallus, and we don't have a lot of species here, but the few species that we have, I've kept records on them, and you can on some species you can just by the clock know it's going to flower about this time of year, about this day. And I've actually had some that actually will start to sprout from the tuber itself. It comes up like a little triangle, and almost to the day every year. Then they're that predictable. But then you have others like the Titan arum that you have no idea how long it's going to be dormant. You have no idea if it's a leaf or a bloom. You have no idea. There's no predictability about it at all. When you see the philodendrons blooming, their inflorescences to me are awesome. As compared to a lot of the anthuriums, they're just kind of there, and they're beautiful in their own way, but they're only the face only a mother can love. They're just not that gorgeous of a plant. They don't have a lot of them. The spathe is just pretty bland. It's green and it turns brown, and you just have this pencil sticking up out of the plant, and it's then some of the berries turn into these beautiful oranges and reds and yellows and lavenders, and that all phases are different, but yeah, they're fun just to see how different they're going to be, but yet all the same, because they all have the same parts, but they come out differently.
Well, there's no disadvantage if they're all pollinated, and the pollination systems are quite remarkable. Imagine philodendron. It opens only just for a few hours. It opens at night, or almost at night. It opens at dusk. It produces this pheromone, which is quite strong. The beetles that visit it can smell this for 200 yards maybe, and then they simply they're kind of half blind. They simply fly along, keeping that vector in their it's like radar. You just get on the scene and off the scene. Then they eventually find the plant by the olfactory sense, but then when they get close, they're usually white, and they kind of crash land on the spathe, fall down inside. I mean that and then when they spend the whole night in there. Of course, they're there for sex because they aggregate there.
Yeah.
But the point is that they get all these flowers pollinated, and then the thing starts squeezing in on them, and then the next night they leave. They never fly in the daytime because the birds pick them off. So this is why birds have very low vision at night, or when it gets at least a bit dark, whereas the beetles, they thrive at that time.
Samorphophallus cutaneus here is showing us the basic form of an aroid inflorescence. It's not a single flower, but many packed into one single package. All of them are generally covered by a leafy spathe and have all of their flowers clustered onto this large column-like structure here called the spadix. In this species, we see the female flowers are near the base, the male flowers are up here at the top, and the rest of this is a starchy structure which sometimes can generate heat. And in the case of this species, like its larger cousin, the Titanarum, well, it's producing a lot of roadkill-like smells, but that attracts its pollinators, and we're going to see a lot of variations on this theme here today. I love this philodendron inflorescence. It's so fleshy, so well protected structurally. It feels like this is probably a species growing up in the canopy, getting buffeted around by wind and storms, and maybe even chewed on by a monkey or two. It's a really interesting structure, and you can tell there's a lot of color variation among these plants. Just so gorgeous. So what you can see here is that not all aroids cluster their flowers at the base of the spadix. Some display them all along the structure itself, and that changes the way in which they're pollinated. Instead of beetles getting stuck at the base, insects can crawl all along the structure, maybe collecting scent, maybe collecting nectar, but it just goes to show you the breadth of the variation on this theme that is present within this amazing plant family. It's one thing to produce flowers in many different shapes, sizes, colors, and even smells. But flowering plants like aroids must complete the reproductive life cycle by getting their seeds out into the environment. For most aroids, this involves fruits.
I have a feeling that for some reason they have a lot of endemic species. Probably more than any family I know, there's a high rate of endemism. And this high rate of endemism means that the plants are they're isolated. because endemics are isolated. Why are they isolated? I think they're isolated because their fruits are bird dispersed. They're bird dispersed and they occur only in the forest. Migratory birds don't go into forests, so they're not carrying seeds from country to country or from place to place. The territorial birds that are dispersing the seeds are not moving. Ant wrens, for example, on Barrow, Colorado Wild, and the fellow who studied them, Ed Willis, studied those. 10 years he came back, and 10 years in a row, these same pair of ant wrens were sitting in the same bush, always in the same place.
Amazing.
And they were territorial. They were keeping the other birds out. So if a species became distinct for the mutation in a spot, it might remain there for hundreds of years. And therefore, it could create a great big population of plants in situ and then not be dispersed to the next hill. Cerro Jefe in Panama, for example, we're still finding endemic species only known from Cerro Jefe. And this is after 50 years of collecting there. And there's almost nothing left, but we're still finding, even in these fragments, we're still finding new species. Lots of new species are being discovered in the most beat up places imaginable.
Now, like all angiosperms, pollination is followed by fruit production. And in the case of aroids, a vast majority of them are producing berries, like we see here in this aglaonema. This one in particular is bright red and fleshy, which means it's probably dispersed by birds. But there's a lot of variations on this theme, and this one is just a tip of that iceberg. So because some aroids produce their flowers all along the spadix, the berries are produced all along the spadix. Now, I don't know how much of a difference that makes for seed dispersal, but it certainly makes for an entertaining and interesting structure to look at.
It is quite amazing when you walk by some of the philodendrons that have leaves that are 3 foot, and you know they're bigger than that. Or when the Amorphophallus titanum actually blooms, that we've been fortunate enough to have 9 of them bloom in the last 6 years. When you see just the size, it does amaze you. And like you said, they all have a spathe and they all have a spadix, but the diversity, the colors, the shapes, the sizes are just amazing.
Well, there are some definite favorites. The two that I would like to mention are both philodendrons. One is a species that I really want to describe. The moment I saw it, it had a long pendant leaf with wrinkled surface and even pale veins, and it was just an astonishingly beautiful plant. But it was sterile, and we kept trying to find fertile material. I finally found one with buds. You know, it's not really appropriate for a type, but I was deciding to name it. I think I was gonna call it splendidum. But over the years, 20 years later, somebody had already used that name. So I decided to name the plant after my wife. So it's Philodendron patricii. And that species I saw recently in Ecuador. It had been imported into Ecuador and it's growing there. Massive leaf, is about almost 2 meters long. It's still a beautiful plant, even though the plant I recollect was only less than 1 meter long. So if you get it in the good conditions, it will grow really nicely. The other really neat plant that I collected years ago was a thing called Philodendron fortunense. It had a beautiful round cordate blade, which was attractive in itself. It was white on the lower side, but it had a beautiful ruffled petiole. The petiole had little ruffles in it. And yet there's yet another one, Philodendron petiolatum. That's another one that has a gorgeous petiole. The petiole is widely winged with a very undulated surface. And the leaf is also very beautiful. I could go on and on with pretty plants. But the philodendrons, I don't work on them as much as I do anthurium because there are a lot fewer of them. But they often make the best cultivated plants. They're not so much affected by the drought conditions. Anthuriums often get this little yellow margin. It's not xanthomonas bacteria, it's just an injury. And then it starts yellowing from the margin. And that yellow can continue on because it's no longer got any protection. So they have a lot more problems. Philodendrons seem to never have any of those cultural problems. They grow slowly. They don't flower very often, but they always remain beautiful in your collection.
Leaves are some of the most obvious features of any plant. After all, they're the main photosynthetic organs. Their ability to capture sunlight and CO2 and turn that into food is famous the world over. Despite the fact that leaves largely serve the same purpose for all plants, there is a bewildering amount of variety from one species to the next, and aroids are no exception. From this relatively small sample of aroid leaf variation, we can begin to understand just how much the physical environment shapes these plants. As we will learn, leaves can tell you a lot about how each species makes a living.
Now, I think one of the most incredible aspects of the aroid family is the diversity in size, color, and texture of leaves. We have large strap-like leaves that are taller than I am. We have these nice, narrow, thin, leathery leaves. We have large palmate leaves. And we also have beautiful heart-shaped leaves. And all of their sizes, textures, and colors tell you something about the environments in which they hail from. Now, another common theme among aroid leaves is this wonderful variegation, and it's something plant breeders have taken advantage of throughout time. And there's a few hypotheses why this might happen in nature. One is that it could potentially protect the leaves from damaging sunflecks as they're growing in the dense shade of the understory. Those little sunflecks can be really intense, and these areas actually lack chlorophyll. Another idea is that this could actually be a form of camouflage. The mottling breaks up the outline of the leaf and makes it less apparent to pollinators. Regardless of why it's happening, it's a beautiful thing that is really lovely to have in a house. Like I said, there is a lot of variation in aroid leaves, and one of the common themes you'll see again is this dissection, like we see with this anthurium species here. And this is all about surface area. Leaves are trying to absorb as much light as they possibly can, and trying not to invest as much energy as they have to in building the actual leaf itself. So by making dissected leaves over solid, non-broken leaves, the plant gets more surface area for less investment. Now, I think the Amorphophallus have taken the leaf game to its extreme, because each one of these structures, from the base of the stem to the tip of these leaflets, is a single leaf. And there's an insane amount of variety in size of this. There's species that are about this tall all the way up to the Titanarum itself. It's amazing to think that this is one single leaf. So I think of all of the aroid leaves out there, Amorphophallus sororis has to have one of my favorites. It's got this nice dark green color, but if you look right on the rim of every little leaflet here is this beautiful pink outline. I have no idea what function it serves, but it is certainly one of the most stunning of all the aroids. So here we see one of the most charismatic of all the aroid leaves, the so-called Swiss cheese plant, because of these holes. And this is a phenomenon called fenestration. And again, like we saw with the dissected leaves, this is all about surface area. By producing leaves with holes in them, they don't have to produce a solid surface. Instead, they can stretch out their photosynthetic surface over a much greater area and take advantage of what light's available in the canopy.
It is also possible that dissected leaves like these can help the plant regulate temperature. This is especially important up in the canopy when exposed to high light conditions. All of that extra surface area may help these plants shed heat a lot more efficiently.
The majority of my collections have been made in neotropical areas. The richest area, unquestionably, is the Chocoan refugium. This area, you could literally go there endlessly, and you continue to find new species. I mean, you could just drive down the road another kilometer, get out of the truck, and you find another population of species that weren't like the ones you saw before. I'm always amazed how many species are aggregated in one spot, and you think you go there and you collect all of them, and maybe you know 3 of them, which is really discouraging after 50 years of work going, whatever you see. Then you go down the road another few kilometers, and you find another group of species. Of course, some of them are the same, but not all of them. In Nariño, I remember working at La Planada, which is high for aroids of 1,500 to 1,700 meters, even up to 1,900 meters. There I only had 55 species of Eriaceae. From there I could see the Rio Imbe. You could literally see it. If you had a gun, you could shoot right to the bank of the river. That was 700 meters lower, and it had a completely different flora. Wow. Then at the same time, I went 37 kilometers down the road to Altaquera, to a place called Rio Ñambe, And I didn't recognize anything in the Rio Nyambe that was at the Rio Imbi, only 37 kilometers away, also in pre-montane rainforest, pre-montane wet forest. So they were the same kind of forest, same elevation, and yet that short distance made a big difference in the species composition of that area. Really, it turns out some of them are the same, but you know, my first impression was these are all different species.
I would say that aroids in general, less is more, and you don't need, and the containers that you grow them in is something you want to keep to the size of the root system. You put it in the smallest pot that you can possibly put it in. Doesn't like a lot of room. A lot of them are epiphytes. They don't need that soil anyway. So if you put them in too much soil, the roots tend to rot back. So you might as well just, I don't want to say cram it in a pot, but put it in the smallest pot that you can comfortably put it in, because it will thank you for it.
So just as the leaves of an aroid can tell you something about its lifestyle, so too can its roots. Here we see the aerial roots of Philodendron williamsii, and it's a vining species that's more at home up in the canopy, but there's not a lot of nutrients up there, so it sends these large woody roots down to find more nutrients into the soil. And as you'll see today, there's so many variations on roots that it's almost just as fun to study them as it is the rest of the plant itself. Check out the roots on this Anthurium ploumanii. This is another species you're more likely to find in the canopy than on the ground. And one of the cool things about these roots is that they form these spongy-like coating on the outside of the root, which actually acts like a sponge. Any water that hits this is instantly soaked up, so it can take advantage of any time the rain comes down, because up in the canopy, you dry out a lot quicker than you do down on the ground in the rainforest. Another really cool thing to notice here is the fact that many of these roots actually are pointing upwards. They're going against gravity, which may seem weird for roots, but a lot of Anthurium species and other aroids in general are litter trappers. They actually collect leaves and debris around them, which helps them form their own soil. Because again, the canopy is such a harsh place to live. There's not a lot of nutrients up there. And by producing their own soil-like environment, they can live a lot longer and do a lot better. I mean, look at the size of this thing. It's pretty remarkable. Now, of course, not all aroids live in the trees. Species like these Anchomanes here, they live in the ground and they produce a different kind of rooting structure. Many of them will produce fibrous roots that get into the soil, but as you can see here, a lot produce storage units called corms or tubers, and these help plants get through the dormant season. After they come back out of dormancy, they'll start to sprout here and then throw up their leaves. But it just goes to show you there's a wide variety of lifestyles within the aroid family.
In the 50 years that I've been working in the field of botany, 56 actually, but all this time, nearly every year I've been to the tropics. I've been down there seeing this forest go away. You know, it's not just our imagination. You can look at a map and you can see that there's still forest there. But if you go back a few years, there was even a lot more forest. So it's constantly being cut off. Every place there is a road, they're cutting the forest off. It may not be immediate, but within a few years, it'll all be gone. So when they build a new road, it means the forest is gone. If you don't get there exactly when they build the road or before they build the road, you know, you're not going to get anything. So they build the road, and within months, the trees are all gone as far as you can see. They're growing either oil palm in the lowlands, or they're growing this naranjillo up in the highlands, or they're growing cacao in the lowlands. They're always cutting it off for some purpose, and it doesn't last very long until the soils have become depleted and they have to abandon it. Now, when they abandon it, it regrows, but it just regrows in secondary growth, especially if they burned it. So there's nothing there. There's no seeds left. There are no sprouts, no seedlings or anything to regrow the forest. So generally, it just ends up being a trash pile of weeds and grass, and they try to raise cattle on it, but there's very little nutrients in the soil, so there's very little nutrients in the grass. So the cows, can have to have hundreds of acres of ground to get proper nutrients. It's not like in Iowa where we grew cows. We could have 35 cows on 13 acres or something. But down there you'd have only one cow on that 13 acres. It's about all you could get.
Hard to swallow. So in thinking about that, this is, I think, the largest collection of aroids, living collection of aroids in the world. Why are living collections so important in the context of conservation?
Well, if we can bring them out alive, and especially if we can propagate and disperse them, it's foolish to bring them out, put them in your collection, and hope that they survive, because everybody loses things. The best approach would be to everybody propagate as much as possible, and to send it to as many people as possible, including ordinary horticulturists who are not affiliated with botanical institutions, because they often have the time to take care of these plants better than the big institutions where they have few people to take care of massive collections. So it's really good to get these plants into the hands of hundreds of people, because that's the way of ensuring their survival. And of course now it's impossible to bring the plants back, so they're just doomed. They're going to all go extinct. There's no way that we can save them, because the forests are going to go.
Yeah, and it's difficult because of regulation and red tape.
Well, they think they're saving them by passing laws, but in fact they're ensuring their destruction, because the laws are not going to prevent people from cutting the forest down. It's easier to get a permit to cut off 1,000 acres of trees to grow oil palms than it is for me to get a permit to collect one sample of a dried specimen. I'm not even asking for a specimen, a living specimen, which is impossible. So these areas are just being decimated through government action in many cases, and they'll set aside a park and so forth. But when you go there, you see it's just being cut off anyway. Yeah. For example, in the Lita San Lorenzo region, one of the richest areas in Ecuador, it is the richest area in Ecuador, they decided that they'd let the people cut off 1 kilometer from the road. Well, that was where the richest part of the forest was, where the road was. Just by chance, it was where all the good species are. So 1 kilometer back, and then 1 kilometer back, you can't see that far. So nobody's going to go back beyond that to see whether they're cutting the forest off anyway. So once they get a kilometer, do you think they'll stop there? No, they just keep on going. So there are very few people to control these aspects, and they usually prefer sitting in a desk in an office in an air-conditioned area rather than being out in the field, inspecting for plant loggers and cutters and so forth. There's attempts to stop it, but it's not being stopped. That's the problem.